pine tree.
Thank you so much, Gabe. And Gabe is part of a small group of language masters and cultural experts that provided the thinking and languages behind our campus, Penobscot campus signage project. So if you're paying attention, there are the directional signs now that are up on campus, and he definitely called out each of the directions, as he mentioned in English. I want to just, again, thank the Mitchell Center and just recognize my colleague, Cindy Eisenhower in anthropology, who helped convene this, I think, in her discussions with Lucas and others, really trying to bring this story to the center of our work and at the University of Maine, and really recognize that there's some really important things happening around land relations, land back, and indigenous Wabanaki peoples here in what is now known as the state of Maine. I want to I'll introduce all the speakers, and this is just a small recognition of each of them. They're all extraordinary in their own ways, and it's hard to encapsulate in a limited time all their work and all they've done. I will go in the order that we'll have them kind of speaking at first, although there'll be some structured interaction across the hour we have. John Banks is the director of the Penobscot Nation Department of Natural Resources, has been in that role for a number of years. He served on many local, regional, national organization boards, including National Tribal Environmental Council, Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, Tribal Operations Committee with US EPA. He has a BS degree in forest protection from the University of Maine, where he was awarded an Indian Fellowship from the Office of Indian Education in Washington, DC. He's been awarded the 2019 Distinguished Alumnus Award from the University of Maine School of Forest Resources. And it's really hard to measure, as someone who works in the natural resource environmental field in Indian country, it's hard to measure or even communicate to you how John is recognized nationally for his work with Penobscot Nation Natural Resource Department. It's everyone knows who Penobscots are in this area, partly, largely due to John's work. Lucas St. Clair is president of the Elliotsville Foundation. He's an avid conservationist, outdoor enthusiast. He's deeply engaged in Maine's communities. He served on advisory boards for a lot of organizations, including Maine Public, Friends of Cottonwoods and Waters, and the Trust for Public Land. And he's really established himself as one of the leading voices for a new formulation around land ethic in the land conservation movement across our region. Lastly, but not leastly for sure, Peter Forbes is the co-founder of First Light, a collaboration of indigenous tribes and conservation organizations dedicated to land justice and aimed at restoring Wabanaki stewardship of land. A leader in the conservation movement, Peter has used his writing, storytelling, and photography to strengthen our connections to each other and the lands that sustain us. He is the author of Our Land, Ourselves, and The Great Remembering. He and his family run a farm in Vermont's Mad River Valley. And again, Peter's work, its impact across the connections between land conservation groups and tribal nations is just starting to kind of bubble to the surface. And he really puts the time in. He's a great ally to indigenous people in doing this work. I'm not going to go into, as much as I want to, give you 37 slides on the history of land back and its relevance for what so many of the projects that we're doing here at the University of Maine and beyond with tribal nations. I will say that the land back movement has as its core set of values a reformulation and reimagining of relationships between people and land that are rooted in indigenous epistemologies and ontologies. And that's just my shorthand of saying that it is not just about returning lands, it's about reestablishing and maintaining relations between humans and non-humans and our natural world, and really reimagining that, and not taking no, that's not possible for an answer. And you'll hear some of those elements and sort of what we have to overcome to do this work from our speakers. I will say that one element, and this is just, you know, an embarrassment on some level, one key part of the movement, the land back movement, is really centered around reforming cultural relations with non-humans and places. And that is sometimes referred to as the rematriation movement. It's not separate from the things we'll talk about today, but it is very purposefully being led by Indigenous women, both locally, regionally, and internationally. The fact that there are not Indigenous women on this panel just shows you that how important a next panel, which would be focused more on some of those pieces, will be done, which David's assured me we can do in the fall. So I'm excited about that and seeing how that works. So just to kick off today, and I will try to subtly moderate this, and we have a lot of folks and a lot of perspectives to get to. I want to hand it over to John Banks and talk about this from the tribal perspective, from the Penobscot Nation perspective, sort of where this story of having, you know, a few hundred acres of land returned to the tribe, what it means in terms of the tribe's recent history, and sort of where this work came from, and why it's important. John.
Thank you, Darren. Chi Willie Wun, Gabe. Thank you for that invocation. I'm John Banks, Natural Resources Director for Penobscot Nation. And it is just amazing to see so many names on this screen and see so many friends that are gathered here with us today. So thank you all for taking the time out today to visit with us. So we don't have a lot of time today, so I'm going to talk really quickly here, and just I want to really once again take this opportunity to thank Lucas and Elliotsville Foundation for their gift of land that they bestowed to the Penobscot Indian Nation last year. There was a 730-acre parcel of land handed over to the Penobscot Nation. And it's this particular piece of land is within our existing land holdings that we have been acquiring under the terms of the 1980 Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act. And through that act, we made an original land transaction with another company back in the 80s. And we acquired 3 separate parcels of land within one township, the township of Williamsburg. And so these 3 pieces were separate, and there was other lands in between each of these parcels. So there wasn't the best geography for management purposes because of the separation, and access was somewhat of an issue. And so this, this gift of land allowed us to consolidate all of these 3 parcels into one parcel because it really fit like a glove with our existing landholders in that town. And it was really the last piece of a jigsaw puzzle that allowed us to consolidate our lands. It provides better access now and better management, easier management. So I guess we'll talk more about what that really means to the tribe in terms of culture and sovereignty later on in the program. But that's my introduction, and thank you again.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate it. just in going now to Lucas, if you could talk about some of the history of how your family came to this land and sort of the kinds of things that led to your decision to give it back to the Penobscot Nation for its stewardship.
Yeah, well, thank you all for joining this conversation. Gabe, thank you for your invocation. It was really beautiful. And it's so exciting to see that so many people interested in this subject. I spent a lot of time working over the last decade on land conservation in Maine, and really focused on public land and land for people, and setting aside beautiful places in Maine where people could access them, and they have restorative power and economic benefits for part of our rural spots and rural communities, and really focusing on the national parks. That was sort of the the kind of holy grail in my mind for so long, and thinking that the highest achievement of land conservation would be to set it aside in our in this democratic way. And so I worked quite a while to along with many other people to create this new unit of the Park Service up at Katahdin Woods and Waters. And shortly after it was set aside, we had a celebration, and the Secretary of Interior came, and some members of our congressional delegation came, and everyone had a chance to speak. And after it was done, a member of the Holton band of Micmac, I believe, or Maliseet. Maliseet came and patted me on the shoulder and said, congratulations for the work that you've done, and this is quite an achievement for Maine and for conservation. But you really left out any mention of indigenous presence, and we're very much still here, and we're very much focused on land conservation, and we're the original stewards of this land. And I think you should learn more about it, before you go too much farther on this conservation journey that you're on. And it was a real awakening for me, and realized that I'd gotten to that point really by making a series of mistakes, and wanted to try to right those mistakes and see if I could bring to the conservation movement that I was working in a form of justice that would feel inclusive, and feel that we would be righting many of the wrongs that had happened. And so early conversations really turned to John, and I went to visit him in his office at the Natural Resources Center on Indian Island, and started talking about land ownership and land conservation, and the work that the Penobscots have been doing, understanding water quality and air quality and fish habitat. And just, it was so remarkable to see this kind of blend of Western science and native practice. And John reminded me that the way in which the Western perspective on land ownership was kind of at odds with an indigenous perspective is that, we as colonial settler conservationists think that we own the land, and therefore get to do what we think is right with it. And as John explained to me, that from his perspective, that we are indebted to the land, and we are we're part of this, and we are from the land, as opposed to we're owners of it. And that really helped me start to change my perspective on why we were protecting land, and who we were protecting it for, and who were we protecting it from. The ideas of conservation and preservation started to make less sense to me. And if I really believed that the land could be stewarded in a way that would be as beneficial for the land and all of the living things on it, then returning parts of it back to the Penobscots, in this case, seemed like the best solution. And so John and I began working together to make that happen. And feel like it's really very much at the start of it, at least for me. I know that the land back movement has been happening for a long time, and there's a lot of incredibly wonderful and focused people in the movement, and it's really exciting to be able to join them and feel like there's an opportunity now in front of us to do more of it. And I think really this is, a moment like this is a real testament to why it feels so right, that the beyond the recognition of a simple act of signing a deed of land over to the Penobscot Nation, the fact that almost 300 people on a Monday afternoon will join us to listen to this conversation, and then what Peter will talk about soon about the First Light learning journey, and the fact that so many people, especially within the conservation movement, are making a real deliberate effort to learn more is really a testament to the fact that we're doing something that is meaningful and right. So thank you so much for having me here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Lucas, so much. So in getting a bigger set of frames on what was just talked about, this particular donation, the small but meaningful donation of land, I want to hand it over to Peter Forbes, where he will talk, I think, more broadly about his engagement and sort of the work that still needs to be done and has been done in terms of the land conservation movement and creating more just relations with Indigenous people and the lands that we all are on. So Peter.
Thank you so much, Darren, and thank you, Gabe. It's a real honor to be included in this panel. So as Darren said, my role is to briefly put this important land return in the context of larger efforts that are going on in Maine and across our country to reconcile history as best we can. Something is underway now in Maine that hasn't happened before, and that is the collective action of more than 60 organizations, land trusts, conservation groups, to relearn history of Wabanaki people and culture that many of us were never taught in school, to center Indigenous voice in our work, and to return land. We collectively have one goal: to expand Wabanaki presence and relationship with land across this landscape called Maine, because this is really, really good for everyone. It strengthens everyone, native and non-native, because it's ultimately about reconciliation. So as Darren said, I'm speaking to you as an insider to the conservation movement. My voice is that of a white man steeped in that movement, but someone who also believes it has a much, much larger promise to fulfill to Indigenous people and to all of our relations. And honestly, I haven't been comfortable talking about this work publicly because, I'm a nose down kind of person. I know we're making good progress. Lucas is right. On a Monday afternoon, the 300 people on this call, but I also know that all relational work is fragile. I sense that this honestly is more of a time for humility and commitment than it is for congratulations. So I joined this story not so that any one of us on this call can be thanked, but to encourage all of us, and especially all of us listening, to do more of the same. This is really, really long work that is just beginning. It's going to continue long after all of us are gone. I want to share some maps and ideas with you really quickly, if I might. So some of you may have seen the first one of these before, but this is a map of Indigenous land loss beginning in 1776. As this unfolds, I just want you to see where it begins, how it turns, where it ends. Let's go back one more time. How it makes its way, its progress across this continent. This is obviously, too, a map of colonization, right? So here is also a map of conservation gains across our country during the exact same time. For me, personally, the sacrifices made by indigenous people are what made me, but absolutely part of what made our conservation movement and the state of Maine. And many of us want to make amends. And many of us believe that the conservation movement is mature enough and strong enough now to recognize this as well. To live here in Maine and be whole requires cultural reconciliation, and land conservation has a role to play in that. And that's really what we're talking about today. I hope this is clear, that the purpose of learning and confronting that history of indigenous land loss isn't to punish anyone. It isn't to punish ourselves. It's actually to liberate us to do our best work on behalf of people and nature. So conservationists and indigenous people have always shared a meta-narrative about that centrality of nature. And therefore, we should have had this unbreakable bond between us. But from the creation of the very first national park in 1872 to today, conservationists have systematically removed Native people from nature, first by taking their land, and then by making that land culturally inaccessible, by making Native people mostly invisible in the conservation movement. This is what we seek to change. And the betrayal around it was this: white people said that nature would be better off without indigenous people. And I've witnessed this betrayal in the land that initiated me in Maine. Although Maine's rivers and mountains still carry Wabanaki names, the people's stories that those names belong to have been mostly relegated to small reservations out of sight to most Mainers. After 350 years of colonization and broken treaties, the Wabanaki now have access to less than 1% of the land that once supported their place-based culture. But in the last 50 years, land conservation groups in Maine have come to steward almost 23% of the state, including countless places of great importance to Wabanaki people, whose burial grounds and neighborhoods are now our second homes, nature preserves, and state parks. And so as a movement, we've had to ask ourselves some fundamental questions. Who owns the keys to these places of utmost importance to Wabanaki people? Well, folks, people who look like me, raised like me, do. And now that these consequences, intentional or not, are within our awareness, we have a responsibility to make amends. And that shift is from land conservation to land justice. And this is what's possible. In Maine, we call it First Light. It's not an organization, but an organizing idea that all of us hold as we seek to work collectively to repair and return at the speed of trust. And at the core of it is three simple verbs: relearn, recenter, and return. And the relearning is, for 3 years now, every year we spent 21 days and more together on the reservations, doing homestays, meeting with chiefs and tribal staff, relearning the history of Maine, reading the treaties, going on canoe expeditions, learning how our different worldviews help and hinder caring for the land. Each year, a new cohort of participants was created. The first cohort had 7 organizations, then 25. This year's cohort has 50 organizations. And recentering. We support the creation of the Wabanaki Commission that was really the genesis of Darren and John to create a forum for Wabanaki leaders on land issues to reach their own understandings and to give direction to us in the conservation movement about what's needed. We've also created a monthly platform for Indigenous people to speak directly to hundreds of the land-owning caste of Maine, land trusts, philanthropies, major timber companies, about what Wabanaki need around land. And centering of Indigenous voice also includes pooling the conservation movement's financial, human, and knowledge resources to end competing among each other and focus on how we as a movement can help Wabanaki people. And that effort is called the Conservation Delegation. And its job is to do the collaborations directly with each Wabanaki community and the commission. What can come of this is strengthening of our shared knowledge of how to protect nature and what she means. These slides are from my colleague, Robin Wall Kimmerer. Many of you know Robin. She's suggesting here the possibilities and a shift in our worldview from stewardship to relationship. Here's the way she observes that the land trust movement and conservation movement sees land. And this is her offering for how land is seen by her community as sacred, as ancestral connection, as home. Is nature something we protect or control or manage, or is nature our mother, our sister, our kin? This is the shift in conservation's worldview from stewardship to relationship. And finally, returning, which is much more sophisticated and nuanced than simply repatriating land. It's really about building the relationships and trust so that we can share things: power, knowledge, money, and land. And this is what has come of that so far. Supporting the Wabanaki Commission, granting legal access to 62,000 acres in Maine for harvesting medicines, holding ceremony, protecting ancestors, returning lands and helping tribes beyond the land return that we are celebrating today. And trainings and introductions to our funders, and where all of this goes, no one knows for sure, but my dream is supporting the co-management of significant public landscapes in Maine. And all of this is through this collective effort to change ourselves. We as a conservation movement are finding our humanity and growing stronger because of that.
Thank you, Peter. It's really good. You present that work in such a great way. And just to continue this engagement, I want to go back to Lucas, and my colleague Aram Calhoun actually framed up your question for you, Lucas. You know, two things to pivot from what Peter has said, Lucas, is if you could talk about sort of how this has changed your perspective or your work on conservation and within the land trust community, and what the future possibilities of this work are. I'd love to hear you speak to that.
Sure. I think what I feel is so important now is a broadening of our relationships and taking a deeper dive into what we can do together and how we can understand one another more, and starting to do some self-examination of of the way we think about individuals, the way we think about Indigenous people. You know, but when I started talking about this land return with folks, that many of which were in the conservation community and, you know, considered progressive folks, lots of folks would say, you know, aren't you worried that they might put a casino there? Or what about if they like wanted to mine the land? And it was such a shock to me to hear people ask that question. Like that's the very first question they're gonna. And so I started to think, well, boy, it's really important to build really deep relationships with people that you're working with to understand what their intention, what the motivation is. And without that, none of this is possible. And I think the fact that we have members of Native community in Maine that are so willing to go be part of this conversation, be part of the teaching and the learning that we as the colonial settler conservation movement is working on is so, we're so fortunate to be in that spot. The fact that John could say to me, you know, this is what you should do. You know, you want to make an impact, you want to do something important, you should give us the land that you have. It would fix, you know, here's how it would fix what we are, you know, some of our challenges, management challenges. To be, for someone like John to be as comfortable and confident in giving me that message is the foundation of this work, and it's how we are going to move forward. And I think that what that can mean for the future is that as these relationships continue to develop and we begin to trust each other more, and our first instinct when we talk about giving land back to Native community in Maine, we think about the wonderful things that they'll be able to do. The fact that they'll have access to brown ash, and that will in turn help another generation learn how to make baskets and how to manage a forest for certain cultural needs. Like that people will immediately start thinking about those wonderful things, as opposed to an extractive historic past or a casino, which is, you know, absolutely not the intention of John and anyone in his community. So as we start to readjust the way we think about our relationship to land and our relationships to Native community in Maine, and we can kind of transcend some of the really racial biases, that unconscious bias that we have, then we'll start, I think, being able to make real progress. And the fact that Maine has so much undeveloped land and a community that has focused on protecting a lot of it, the fact that we have 23% of our land mass is in some sort of conservation, it's a good foundation to then move on to this next level of, and so it'd be much more difficult if we were 75% federally owned land, or if there were if it was broken up into little small chunks and it was all private. So we have a great foundation to start working on this in which I consider really meaningful environmental justice work. And that foundation is I think relatively strong, and we're in I think a great position to launch into what the next phase of what conservation will mean in Maine.
I thank you, Lucas, and thank you for you've been able to speak to this now a few times, and I'm just really, your clarity and sort of why it's important is so critical. And I think you're answering many of the questions in our chat too while you're doing it. So in the last piece of our formal presentation, I'm going to hand it back over to John Banks and basically ask you, John, like, how does this work fit into, you and I have been around working on tribal sovereignty and environmental protection issues for a few years. Maybe you got a few years head start on me, but I feel like we've been doing this for a while. How does this fit into that larger work where we face challenges at times with the state government, federal governments, and in that kind of context? But what does this mean in terms of that, in terms of your management of lands by Penobscot Nation and into the future? How does this fit in?
Well, I sometimes use the analogy of the boarding schools that young Indian children were put into. If, historians talk about the history of Native American affairs or tribal affairs in this country, they divide it up into different eras. One of the eras was the era of assimilation, in which the greater society tried to assimilate tribal people into mainstream society. And part of that was taking a lot of Indian children off from the reservations and putting them in boarding schools. And that's, that assimilation leads directly to acculturation, which is really a form of cultural genocide. So, our tribe, for instance, the Penobscots, through the various treaties that were entered into under duress, our original territory went from the Machias River drainage to Cape Ann, Massachusetts. And we were reduced over time to a small, very small stretch of the Penobscot River with a few islands in it. And now they're trying to take that, by the way, which is another whole story. But so, they need to get the kids out of these boarding schools and get them back onto the reservation so they can learn to be Indians again, so they can practice their cultural traditions. And they need land to do that. Our tribal cultures are so connected to the lands. We owe our history to the Penobscot River. And so, our tribe has been, we've survived. We've had to give up a lot to survive, but we're still here, has been said in the past. And, the Land Claims Settlement Act was a great start in 1980. That was a result of the treaties being found to be illegal because they were never ratified by the federal government, by the US Congress, as is required by federal law. So we got a start back in 1980, and it's been, the lands that we have gotten back have provided a lot of opportunities for tribal members to engage in culturally relevant employment. We have a long history of being guides. Many of our tribal ancestors were guides for the newcomers because they knew the land so well, they knew the ecology. And so I know you've all probably heard about Henry David Thoreau and his Penobscot guides. But we have, since 1980, we have tribal members that are starting guiding business and starting to make a living, providing guiding services, as well as hunting and fishing and gathering materials, birch bark and brown ash for basket making, medicinal plants. And it's important to understand that where we come from is, it's based on our inherent stewardship responsibilities. Sometimes we talk about fishing and hunting rights, but we never talk about those without talking about the responsibilities for proper management and proper stewardship. So I'm going to stop and see if we can get into questions and answers. I know there's a lot of people on here and there's a lot of questions coming up through the chats. So I guess I'll stop there.
Thanks, John.
What else to say at this point other than thank you all.
I appreciate it. I guess I'll hand it over to Linda, who I believe has been monitoring chat.
I have.
Yes, and maybe you can lead us through these last 12 minutes that we have together.
My pleasure. It's so great to learn today. It's just so much for all of us to think about. And that's very clear from some of the questions that people have raised. Would take months to talk about, and they're important kinds of questions. So one of the things that I encourage all of us to be thinking about is continuing the discussion. continuing what we have been talking about here today. Darren started us out in an important way as we began our hour together. And one of the things that Darren said was, people will say to you, no, that's not possible. And that one of the most important things that we can do is to listen, but ignore. So don't assume that things aren't possible. So Darren, would you like to add anything to that important starting insight you began us with today?
I'd be happy to. Thank you for the question, Linda. Part of it is, many people have said this, that the environmental crisis or the climate crisis is a crisis of the imagination. And I'm as, grounded in the earth as I can possibly be, and a realist, I think, in every way. But I do think the possibility of an indigenous-led, land-based set of cultural parameters that could structure our entire society is an opportunity and not a threat. It is possibly the future. It is possibly our one primary future for existing as human beings. And I think, there are some decisions coming up in the next few years, like the 30% of land on Earth, protected by 2030. There's a whole series of different elements around that. I don't want that to be a kind of colonial green land grab, because whose territories are we talking about? It's primarily indigenous peoples, and it's primarily, if you do the research, I'm a research person, indigenous land management and controls are equal to and often surpass the land conservation, the effects of land conservation on ecosystem services and any number of other metrics. So I'll go with the science, I'll go with the language of possibility and our future of living on this planet as human beings.
Thank you, Darren. Very informative. Across the different points that people raised, important discussions of stewardship. And one of the questions that was asked is, in an ideal sort of thinking, what would stewardship look like? We have so much going on and thinking about there. Are there any thoughts on the part of the speakers about how should we be thinking about stewardship and learning from each other about it?
Can I take a crack at that to begin?
Sure.
These are dreams. One dream is that every stewardship department of every conservation organization would change its name to become relationship departments. Another is that much of our public lands become co-managed with Wabanaki entities. Many of our existing conserved lands be legally granted access to Wabanaki through the form of cultural respect agreements. The way in the 1970s that the whole idea of conservation and breaking up the bundle of rights and conservation easements was created, we're right on the verge today of coming up with new ways of defining human use of the land that is grounded in relationship, not just stewardship. And we have the chance in Maine to really make all of that possible through this relationship between Wabanaki people and conservation organizations.
Thank you. Very, very important and very interesting. Peter, you shared some informative maps, maps that gave a sense of past, present, the potential for future. If we were to share those maps, with others who weren't able to be here today, what would you like us to think about saying in terms of those maps?
I'm not sure. I think that that they are a story in progress, and we have not yet written the end of that story. That's what I would ask you to say. And we are in the process of trying to write a new ending to that story, and that is about sharing land, returning land, holding land together, learning from each other, doing important work together to figure out how to live in Maine, how to live on this planet.
Thank you. Very, so much to think about. Lucas, you talked a lot about learning and awakenings for you, and righting wrongs, and Western science and Native knowledge and coming together. If we all want to move from where we are and what we don't know, do you have recommendations for books we might look at, courses, storytelling that we should listen to? And this is really a question for anybody who is on the panel. So how do we learn?
I think, well, certainly Darren has shared with me and Peter has shared with me some really great articles and academic papers and books that they've written and also that they've shared. And I've had the opportunity in my work now to spend a lot of time working with a Wabanaki advisory board that is made up of members of the four tribes, and have archaeologists and anthropologists and artists and lawyers, and they have been able to offer a lot of insight into various aspects of Native community and cultural knowledge. But I will say that right now there is a huge amount of asks that are being put into into Native community in Maine, and there are a lot of people being asked to do a lot of things, and so I think it's somewhat incumbent on us to, as white people, to do some of this work ourselves. And there are a lot of resources out there, and there's a lot of wonderful stories, and but I think it really is up to us to do a lot of the work. And I think in some ways there are easier ways to sort of integrate into some of these learning, and First Light is a great example. But I also, what has been the most powerful thing for me is in the last year and a half, I've become good friends with Gabriel Frey, who's a basket maker, who was gracious enough to say, hey, I'm going to go cut down some ash trees outside of Holton, and if you want to come with me, I need the help to carry they're heavy, So my son and I went and met him and spent a day harvesting and then pounding those trees, and then over the course of a few weeks, spent a bunch of time in his studio, in his basement, splitting those ash strips and weaving them into a basket together. And as we sat for hours and hours and hours, he told me stories about the music that he likes to listen to, and what it's like raising children, and what it's like being an artist. And I told him recipes of things that I like to cook, and we became really good friends. And he now has been able to call me out on things that I don't think he would have felt comfortable calling me out on. And I've been able to feel more comfortable about the language choices that I use, and asking him questions that I, may be culturally insensitive or not, that I would have just steered away from. So I think, Peter's stewardship should be relationship department is like, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to just go deep in relationship building, and how that's really where the learning for me has become the most important and valuable.
I also, if I might, everything Lucas said is beautifully stated. And I also want to do a shout out to our colleagues at Maine Wabanaki Reach, who have just done a fantastic job for years of doing trainings to help the white culture and the white conservation movement understand how to be better allies. First Light has relied on Reach's abilities to help us see things we can't see. And they're an enormously important resource for this transformation in Maine as well.
Thank you. One other question, well, there are hundreds of questions in the chat, but several people have wanted to know more about the flowage rights and water back, and could the panelists speak to water back / fish back? Any thoughts about, especially as we're thinking about the Penobscot or in other ways?
I think most folks understand the sacredness of water and that it provides life. It has provided the Penobscot Nation with the ability to survive and thrive for thousands of years. The waterways allowed for us to get to wherever we needed to get to gather all of the materials, the necessities for life, and to carry on commerce with other neighboring nations. It's just critical. And of course, it provides habitat for migratory fish at Penobscot. There would, at the end of sometimes long, difficult winters, folks would be getting kind of hungry, and in the springtime, the fish runs would come up, and we would harvest those by the thousands, harvest salmon right there in Milford, Maine by the tens of thousands by spearing and netting, and also providing the fertilizer for our gardens to grow vegetables. So yeah, it's, I don't know, this is the first time I've heard that phrase, water back, but I like it. Thank you.
Great. I know we've used up our time, and I'm speaking for me and hopefully for lots of other people. The first thing that I'm going to do is walk away from my computer, and the first person that I encounter, which will be my husband, Larry, who couldn't listen today, I will try to tell him what I learned and all the questions that I have. And so I'm hoping for each and every one of you that there's someone that you'll now talk to and that will spread the word about the questions we have and the learning that we're doing. And as the speakers had all kinds of important things to say, but one of the things was history is challenging, reconciliation is important, learning from each other is important, and that's what we all need to do. So although the speakers can't see our faces, if we can all clap where we are and let them know how much we appreciate them taking the time for us to learn. So thank you.